Yo, what's good, people? Izzy Max here, back again for week 7 of the pregame for MDL. I am joined, as always, by Dan. How you doing?
Bye week and feeling good.
Yeah, I noticed that when I was making the slides. But this week, there are some actual big games that are going to have huge playoff implications. We are kind of getting down into the thick of things. I think for most people, there are only 3 games left. So these are going to be super important, but without further ado, we'll jump into the transactions. There are only 4. I think we have 2 weeks left, so we're going to see less and less of these, probably. So why don't you... No, I'll start with John, so you can take me for the last one. John's dropping Drampa for Slowbro. On paper, you're like, wow, that's kind of weird. You know, he already has a Psychic type. But Slowbro kind of does what the other Psychic type wants to do. Set Trick Room and also kind of be offensive. And Drampa isn't really doing anything for him. His main offense in things like the Rhyperior are already weak to fighting. And then you're going to get ice coverage for things like the Thunderous. So I feel like for John, Drampa's just been kind of hard to bring. And I think Slowbro does offer him a little bit more of that Trick Room, setter, and offensive pressure that I think he's kind of missing. What do you think about this one?
I think it's an okay trade for him. Like, typing, it doesn't make the most sense, but the trade-off of the damage for the utility, like, I think it's probably an upgrade for what his team could use, especially given the results of last week and how much various speed controls seem to be effective against him.
Yeah, I will agree. Why don't you take the next one?
Yeah, so Noah dropped Umbreon for a physical attacker that's weak to fighting types, which is also Tyranitar and Excadrill on his team. I'm not a huge fan of this. I think Umbreon provided some very, very nice supports for his team and was a headache in building. Granted, it was also weak to fighting. But
it wasn't weak to ground.
Yeah, but Copperaja just compounds his weaknesses with Tyranitar, Excadrill, Copperaja, and Marowak A being his main offensive modes that aren't Gyarados and Alcremie, all being weak to ground and 3 of them being weak to fighting.
All you need is a dark ground and fighting moves. Dark ground fighting moves.
It just feels rough for his team. Like, and even a Max Quake, and you're starting to weaken up the Alcremie because that's going to be attacking on the special side.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Max Quake into his team just seems so good, except for just Gyarados, and that's kind of going to be reflected in our Mons of the Week spoiler.
Yeah.
So, but why don't you tell me a bit about Ryan's transaction?
Yeah. So Ryan is making. I don't know if it's a pure upgrade. I don't know if it's a downgrade. This is going to be one that we have to kind of see play out. He's dropping Persian for Cottony. Now, what Cottony does provide in that tier that Persian Alola is in is Priority Tailwind. It is a transfer move. Yes, Whimsicott gets it naturally, but Cottony doesn't. But since we are playing with transfer moves, things like Follow Me, Cottony does get Tailwind. So it does provide some faster support options, but it is paper thin. Where Persian can take some hits and do things like Thunder Waves, Snarls, Taunts, Fake Outs, Icy Winds, Cottony pretty much has to be Focus Sash every week. It's going to set Tailwind and maybe get like a Charm or a Fake Tears off. So this is going to be one that we have to wait and see if it actually works out. What do you think about this?
I can agree with that. I understand why his team wants Priority Tailwind, especially with some of the transactions that he's made recently. But it's also going to put a lot of item pressure on the Focus Sash for his team. And if there's something that's faster than Cottony that can stop it from putting up that Tailwind, it's going to be taunt bait every week. Mm-hmm. Like, Cottony is prime taunt bait.
Yeah, and I would almost say now if you see Cottony and Raichu on the same team, once you find that Focus Sash, you kind of nail down his support core.
Yep.
But last one.
Yeah, you dropped Armaldo for Centiskorch. It's the bug transaction. I'm kind of sad because Armaldo's really cool, and I thought it had a lot of potential on your team, even though it didn't really get used nearly as much as I thought it could have been used this season. But I do understand it, especially given this week's matchup. I think Scorch looks really good on paper, and it might have some long-term ramifications. Fun fact about Scorch is my first ever team in Sword and Shield that I took on ladder had a Scorch on it, so I do
Scorch
enjoy
gang.
Scorch.
Hell yeah. No, Armaldo didn't get to shine because I wasn't using Pelipper very much. And 45 base speed is just real awkward. Even with Pelipper, it wasn't outspeeding a lot of the faster stuff. And it was physical. Like, I can run Scorch special if I want. It's got a respectable special stat. And with Flash Fire, it is kind of helping me with what the Pelipper was doing by weakening those fire moves anyway. And you really don't want to power up a Scorch. So that'll do it. Those are the transactions, short transaction week this week. But first one is Gummy versus Anthony. So for me, I ended up picking kind of the two powerhouses in the Volcanion and the Dragapult. It's more obvious why the Volcanion got picked for Gummy, because it just matches up really, really well. Once he can kind of deal with the Venusaur with the speed stuff. After that, there's really not anything outside of setting up a Colossal that can really do a sizable chunk or even one-shot this Volcanion. So I'm not quite for sure what Anthony is going to do, because this has to be on his radar during prep, and I know Anthony's just a super good prep and battler. So I don't expect it to be just a straight-up wall, but I do see the Volcanion being a huge issue. And alternatively, I ended up picking the Dragapult. It also matches up fairly well into everything just because Dragapult gets access to a lot of things. This might be the week where we actually see special Dragapult, where we see maybe like Flamethrower Fire Blast or Thunderbolt and things like that, just to deal with a lot of the other threats that Gumi has, like the Rillaboom and the Tornadus, and even that Volcanion with the Thunderbolt or Thunder if he sets Rain. So I'm picking the two offensive mons this week. Why don't you tell me what you picked?
Yeah, so I picked Runerigus, not necessarily because I think it's going to come, but because of what it represents in prep for Anthony. Anthony's team can very naturally outspeed Gumi's team really consistently. However, Runerigus is a really good Trick Room setter against his team in terms of being able to survive something and set Trick Room. The thing that threatens it most is the Barraskewda, which is why I think Barraskewda always needs to come on team preview, even though it's not great into the Volcanion and the Rillaboom. So I just think it's not necessarily what is going to happen, but things that need to be shown in team preview that will affect the brings of everything else. Because if Gumi doesn't bring this Trick Room mode, he's almost surrendering speed control to Anthony early game, and I don't think he can do that, because while Volcanion is going to be probably the offensive focal point for him, Volcanion really likes going first. So he needs to find the most efficient way to make that happen.
Right.
And I do just think the Barraskewda is generally threatening outside of the Volcanion and Rillaboom as well.
Yep, I agree. Moving on, you take Ryan and Dena.
Yeah, so for Ryan and Dena, it's an interesting matchup because outside of Raichu, Ryan dies to Tapu Koko. I guess he has Nidoking as well, which is pretty good against it. But everything else, almost everything else, just gets bodied by a good Tapu Koko set. And so I think Coco's got to be the pick for Dena because of how much offensive pressure it's just going to provide. And Raichu has to be the pick for Ryan because this might be a week where he really wants to focus Ash on the Raichu and doesn't bring the Cottony, which is what we were talking about, because this Raichu needs to survive long enough for this Coco to at least be partially dealt with, because if this Raichu goes down and Coco comes out at full health afterwards, it's going to be a rough day for Ryan.
Yeah, I agree. I ended up going with my boy Melmetal, mostly because it just hits everything extremely hard. And then outside of the Celesteela, nothing really wants to deal with it. Celesteela can take some hits because Melmetal doesn't get access to Fire Punch, which is understandable. It's a big ball of metal. But then other than that, I picked Arcanine. Yes, it doesn't match up extremely well with taking like spread damages or like a Max Quake from the Melmetal, but access with Intimidate to neuter the Melmetal, which is honestly the real only physical attacker outside of Pangoro and Tauros. But you're able to also use those spread moves to fade the Raichu. And the Butterfree. Granted, Butterfree's not going to want to take a Heat Wave anyway. And you're hitting the Melmetal on the special side. So I kind of went with the slower paced, heavy hitting mode with Dena, and more of kind of Ryan's playstyle, just being bulky and putting off some good damage. So yeah, the Raichu is going to be key. I'm not going to lie. So moving on. Next one is going to be me and Burst. So go ahead.
I really wanted to pick Glastrier for Burst because that's always the answer, but you have Melmetal, so I couldn't do it. So I was looking at his team and thinking, okay, well, what does he have that can 1v1 a Melmetal? Landorus Eye, if he maintains speed control, definitely a possibility there, but you also have a Mamoswine, so I don't necessarily love the chances of that happening. His rain mode, not really. Ferrothorn could do it. A couple iron defenses, some body press, maybe some leech seeds. And then I'm looking more at your team, and I'm like, unless Latios is bringing Flamethrower or Hatterene's bringing Mystical Fire, you don't have a great way to hit Ferrothorn. So I think that could be his way to go here. I mean, you're probably going to bring Komo to counter it as a potential, but I do think it has a lot of potential if he can deal with the best answers to it. But then I saw the bottom text on yours that said Centiscore GGMX. I'm like, yeah, this thing looks awesome this week. 1, hits Glastrier. 2, hits Ferrothorn. I mean, that's really all you need to do against this team, but it also does decent output into Landorus, if I'm remembering some of my preliminary Centiscorch calcs that I did months and months ago when I was looking at it in a different league. Like, it has more output than you'd think, and Burst is going to need something like that Archeops just to answer Centiscorch, because if that Centiscorch starts going off, it's going to go all the way off. But why don't you tell me a little bit about this week without spoiling your techs?
Okay, so this is actually a funny matchup. No offense to Burst. You can't set Tailwind because I have a Trick Room mode. You can't set Trick Room because I have a Trick Room mode that's slower than yours. Good luck. I mean, honestly, seeing how much that Burst relies on Glastrier and my team with Melmetal, Como-O, Centiscorch, hell, even Hatterene with a Mystical Fire, and Electivire. So you're not being able to hit those offensive mons first, and it I don't know, it's gonna feel kind of rough. I'm not tooting my own horn, but Centiscorch is coming, and it's gonna be funny. So next,
great.
Yes, Jess and John. This one is big for both. This one, if Jess wins, keeps her kind of out of that wild card slot for now. And if John doesn't win, he's in some rough spots because I don't really think his schedule gets easier. But I ended up picking the Zarude. For the games that it's able to come to, it's been doing a decent amount of work, and I think it could actually come to this one. Other than Marshadow really hitting it for super effective, if somehow Jessica is able to get speed control, or maybe this thing's scarfed, it handles a lot of what Johnny wants to do. Marshadow, Gothitelle, Rhyperior, even Mr. Mime, Slowbro, Klefki can't really do anything to it. Malamar doesn't want to take like a U-turn or something, and Sandaconda with the Power Whip. I just think the Zarude has a lot of offensive potential. And then alternatively, I did end up going with the Thundurus, and not so much the support set, because I don't think Johnny really needs things like Thunder Wave and stuff. Either Johnny's trying to outspeed everything with the Marshadow, or he's going to set Trick Room and try to underspeed some of Jessica's threats. So I do think like a special Thundurus could be kind of cool here. Gets access to Sludge Bomb, Dark Pulse, actual Air Slash, which I think is going to be kind of important. So I think an offensive Thunders could actually be crucial here. If it comes, I don't know. I don't think we've seen it yet this season, but I think it'd be kind of cool and honestly very useful. What do you think about this one?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because Zarude, I think, is a high leverage mon, but I also think that it looks a little suspect into, Thunderous, Hitmontop, Rose Raid, and even Malamar to some extent. Whereas Mimikyu looks generally solid into everything because it will be able to KO back the Marshadow after it gets Disguise broken, stuff like that. But that Zarude potentially being suspect leads me to think that it might not necessarily come because it hasn't been something that Jess has brought super often when the matchup hasn't looked great for it. And that's why I picked Rhyperior, because if the Zarude doesn't come, Rhyperior just kind of goes nutty. But I do think the Mimikyu for potential speed control, a max option, just all the different things Jess can do with Mimikyu is going to be really great. And then I think this Rhyperior is going to be the offensive option that's going to sort of force Zarude to come in at least to team preview. But even then, I don't think Zarude is one-shotting Rhyperior, and I do think Rhyperior gets the one-shot back. So, I don't know. It feels really weird, this matchup.
Yeah, a lot of the offensive threats get checked by the others. You look at Jessica's team, and if you're putting all your eggs in the Rhyperior basket, there's a Rude. Magnezone hits it decently with the steel coverage, and then you got that the hail mode. But then Rhyperior also answers a lot of things. Also, Jess does have the water Urshifu. So, I don't know. This one's going to be fun and interesting, and I think honestly might be my game of the week. But moving on to Tay and Toxic. This one is interesting. So for Tay, I ended up picking the Zoroark. Mostly because it can do some interesting things. And if Toxic goes for this Liepard lead, outside of a fake out, it can't do anything to whatever it thinks the Zoroark is. And that could just turn into a wasted turn. Tay doesn't have a ghost type? No.
Correct.
So fake out might be just kind of free, but if for whatever reason Toxic thinks he might have a better play, I do think the Zoroark can kind of just waste a turn off of this Liepard, and it does have some decent offensive presence as well. But alternatively, I did pick the Crobat for Toxic. Not only does it hit some things with super effective damage, but I don't think that's going to be its role this week. It really wants to set up that Tailwind. Toxic's team's not the most fast thing in the world, but with a Tailwind, it is going to be able to outspeed everything that Tay has other than that Hawlucha. So I do think Tailwind's going to be relatively important for Toxic and what he wants to do. If it goes off, if the Crobat is able to get the Tailwind off, I do think Tay is gonna have kind of an issue this week. But why don't you tell me about your two mons?
Yes, I picked Liepard. Initially, the Zoroark did make me a little nervous about Prankster Shenanigans not being able to Prankster Shenanigans, but then I remembered he's got NDDF, so he can actually just run on Burden Liepard if he wants, which I think is an interesting set this week for him. I don't know if it's right, but it's something he definitely has to look at, because fast foul play can do stuff to the Jirachi, and then you're going to be outspeeding everything naturally instead of having to rely on Prankster. And then Tay's Trick Room mode is kind of sus. So I do think Unburden Liepard is going to be the play this week, and it's going to be a really interesting play. For Tay, I think this Volcrona set is really super solid because Toxic runs Psychic Spam, I think, every week. And you want to know what beats Psychic Spam? Max Bug. That's it. That's really all I got to say. Like, he's just going to max it, maybe get up a Quiver Dance, and just start casting Flutterbys. And
well, outside of what the Zapdos and the
Zapdos.
Diggersby, yep. Honestly, nothing wants to take a hit from this thing.
Yeah. The only issue is if the Zapdos switches into the other slot, gets the +2 boast, then you're in for a bad day. So you got to play smart with it. But I do think the Volcrona is going to be very solid this week.
Agreed. And finally, we have Charles and Noah. For this one, I ended up picking the Blastoise. There's not really a surefire way that Noah has to break through this outside of like some crazy Cradily crap. Just supportive Blastoise, which is what it's been every week this week. I think it's the same thing, and I think it does extremely well into this, especially just physically offensive or physically defensive. And we kind of touched on that with the transaction. There's not really a special mon inside outside of Gengar, which is the other mon I picked, Cradily and Alchemy. So Blastoise is going to be really hard to break through. And with Charles's offensive threats, that is terrifying. But for Noah, I ended up picking Gengar. So mostly because it is really the main special threat that Noah has. And it is going to be able to answer some of these things with its coverage and good speed stat. Tapu Lele doesn't really want to take a Shadow Ball. It does get Thunderbolt. But other than that, like, it does have decent output, but I think it's going to be really hard to position. And I just don't like really any of Noah's physical threats in this matchup. But why don't you tell me about your mons?
Yeah, so let me address Noah's first. I picked Marowak because I didn't want to pick Alchemy and or Gyarados for the 7th week in a row. But they're edging in on the edge of the screen, trying to get in, saying you need the things to fight the ground types, and they're kind of right, because for Charles, I picked Nidoqueen, which, if you missed our conversation at the top about transactions, Noah's team is super weak to ground type moves, and it hits really hard. Life or Earth Power hits everything on this team super hard, except for Gyarados.
And it gets Thunderbolt.
And it does get Thunderbolt. But I do think that this Marowak offensively looks pretty good. If Noah can set it up under favorable conditions, it'll one-shot the Genesect pretty easily. It'll take out the Lele, take out the Celebi, the Drifblim, the Weavile, maybe even the Cursula. I think that there is potential for this Marowak to do well. But man, Nidoqueen looks so good offensively this week.
Marowak's got to break through Blastoise.
Yeah. Max Ghost, followed by Max Ghost, maybe. I don't know.
It might. I don't know. But anyway, I said my match of the week. What's yours?
I'm gonna pick a surprising one and go with Tay and Toxic.
Okay.
This was a tough decision this week, but I think in the blue division, the loser of this match is gonna have a really tough time making even the wild card spot.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why it's my match of the week, because it's a very high leverage playoff match for both of them. And I think the mind games with Unburden versus Prankster and is the thing on the field is or not is actually just going to be pretty fun to watch.
So we both picked games that have wild card implications. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, every week it seems like I'm saying, oh, probably Hector versus Maxwell because they're both good right now.
Yeah, who cares? We're both making playoffs. Give me something interesting. Yeah, I get it. And I think that's why I kind of picked mine too. But I hope you enjoy your bye week. Is there anything you want to say before we let off?
Nope, not really.
All right. Well, we will see you guys in the next one. Peace.